In this video, I'm going to tell you what Games Workshop should and shouldn't do with Warcry in 2025. Is it dead or something else? So, Warcry, huh? If you don't know what Warcry was, I'll tell you real quick. It was a Games Workshop fantasy skirmish game set in the world of Age of Sigmar. Think kind of like Kill Team, but in Age of Sigmar, and then you'd be pretty close. It played on the same kind of small-sized board as Kill Team, 22 by 30 inches, and it generally had 4 to 15 models per side. It had these kind of special bespoke forces that you would buy to play like in the newer versions of Kill Team, but it also had a compendium book that allowed you to use a very wide selection of current Age of Sigmar figures as well. Now, some of you will notice that I'm talking about Warcry in the past tense, and that's with good reason. Warcry came out originally in 2019 and then had kind of a second edition come out in 2022. Games Workshop generally releases their games on a kind of annoying 3-year treadmill, except for maybe a few outliers in their catalog. And therefore, a new edition of Warcry was expected for this summer 2025. However, there hasn't been a peep about Warcry on the Warhammer community website since September of 2024, nearly 8 months ago as of this recording. And it's a little bit more than just radio silence. A few months back, the official Games Workshop web store listed the entirety of all Warcry product as online only, and the Warhammer stores have allegedly been sent information to remove the Warcry products from the shelves. And there was supposed to be, according to this missive, some sort of follow-up article on Warhammer Community that was related to the move, right? But now that article still hasn't appeared, so I'm not really sure whether any of that stuff about the physical stores, being told to take it off the shelves was actually true or not. I don't know any Warhammer store managers because we don't have any specific Warhammer stores real close to where I live. But the Warcry product being online only on the Games Workshop web store is true, and it's still true today. Also, Adepticon, the biggest miniatures wargaming convention in the US, and potentially I think maybe also the world, has kind of come and gone, and Games Workshop had their traditional Wednesday night preview show. They're talking about new products and all that kind of stuff and whatnot, and nothing was said about Warcry, not a word. This seems significant, as it was generally kind of believed that if Games Workshop was going to announce a 3rd edition of Warcry in the summer, Adepticon would have been where it was announced. So the real question that is probably on your mind now, Uncle Adam, why are you talking about this? Games Workshop probably has reasons for their actions, like low sales or some other kind of corporate bugaboo, right? What's it matter? Well, it matters to me because I really like Warcry. In fact, I think that it's the best game that they have currently available, even though it's only available online only currently. The rules are excellent and fast-paced with really interesting game mechanics. Also, the bespoke model sets are amazing sculpts for the most part, and you can also have more agency over how you build your warband by using the great compendium that I mentioned to build custom teams as well. The initial Warcry launch box back in 2019 included some of the best terrain sets that Games Workshop has ever made for any of their games, in my opinion. When 2nd edition was launched, then it was unfortunately a lot of those weird-looking meat trees, but the game itself was still very solid. The 2nd edition didn't make sweeping changes, kind of like the difference between 1st and 2nd edition Kill Team did, right? But instead, it just added some sort of small tweaks, like the reaction system, which made their best current rule set, at least in my opinion, even better. So, since it kind of seems like the writing's on the wall, as they say, and there won't be any more Warcry, new or otherwise, then I've got some ideas on what Games Workshop should do and not do going forward. The first one, honestly, is pretty easy. If they're discontinuing Warcry, then they should put all of the rules up as free PDFs on the download section of the Warhammer community site. Now, I know that some of the core rules and the compendium are actually already there, but they should stay there, and all the other, Warcry books, the current ones from 2nd edition, should be put up there as well. Now, why would they bother? Well, it's because of that compendium, which allows you to use hundreds of current Age of Sigmar models in Warcry. If you keep those PDFs up there, which will cost, honestly, very, very little per year, like in server costs and traffic and whatnot, they would see people who want to play Warcry buying more of the Age of Sigmar models that are compatible with Warcry. They wouldn't have to necessarily, Games Workshop wouldn't have to support the game, but people that wanted to play would still be able to do so, and it would probably drive some sales to, again, like I said, the existing Age of Sigmar line. And also, there's precedent. For years and years back in the day, you could go to the old Specialist Games section of the Games Workshop website. Specialist Games was basically the division that made the games that weren't like Warhammer 40K or Warhammer Fantasy. Games like Necromunda and Blood Bowl and Mordheim, to name a few. These days, now we have new versions of Necromunda and Blood Bowl available to purchase, but not Mordheim. Yet, Mordheim is still amazingly popular for a game that hasn't had a new release since like the mid-2000s. And I think it was because of the free PDF that they used to have online. Free PDFs on the Games Workshop website would help to extend the life of a game like Warcry, which they perhaps are not supporting anymore. Would the game still be played in tournaments at big conventions and such? Probably not. Usually competitive players kind of like there to be updates and balance changes and all that kind of stuff, so they feel like the game is more supported. However, casual players would still have access to the excellent rule set and, be able to play with Age of Sigmar models that they'd buy from their local store. And it could gain traction and eventually be like Mordheim is today, which is still played all over the world. Speaking of Mordheim, one thing that Games Workshop shouldn't do is decide to remake Mordheim. I've seen a lot of speculation online about how that's maybe something that they're going to do if Warcry is, truly gone. And I don't think it'd work out well for anyone. Mordheim, if you're unfamiliar, was a skirmish game played in the old world, not in Age of Sigmar. It was played on a 4-foot by 4-foot board, and it was best if the board was really quite dense with terrain. It was an earlier time, and people were more interested in scratch building their terrain for Mordheim boards back then. Games Workshop even made books about it. Nowadays, they'd have to tool up tons of all new plastic forces and terrain for a new Mordheim game, which would be a huge financial gamble. Or they'd use older models coming from the old world, which, they've brought back and everything like that, which would put off some players. Or they could move the world of Mordheim into the Age of Sigmar, which would potentially put off other players as well. The rules would end up being completely different than the original ones, I would suspect, and then that would end up making two types of Mordheim players, which would fracture the player base within their own title, which is weird and hasn't really happened too much before, I don't think. Maybe Necromunda, I don't know. It just all kind of seems like a big risk. Honestly, if they wanted an easy and low-impact way to bring back Mordheim, just to kind of get off subject here a little bit, they could just follow the advice that I suggested in the past, Pachow, and re-release the original book in a print-on-demand format on Wargame Vault or Drive-Thru-RPG. They're the same company, so, whatever. People who wanted it could then buy a physical copy from one of those places, and it would be nearly no risk to Games Workshop, as print-on-demand books don't need to be printed in bulk ahead of time, like someplace, and then shipped around the world. They don't need to be warehoused, all that stuff. They're printed on demand, hence the name. They could literally set up the file, all that kind of stuff, set it and forget it, and then just let the money trickle or maybe even flow in. Another thing that they should do is take a good long look at their current game lineups and see if maybe they just don't need a fantasy skirmish game, right? They gave Warcry a good try, and though I loved it, it didn't seem to sell that well, right? Otherwise, they'd still be releasing things for it, or at least talking about it on official channels. And they're just not. Just because there's like a skirmish sci-fi game, right? Kill Team, which is on its like 3rd edition at this point now, doesn't mean that there has to be a skirmish fantasy game, I suppose. I mean, maybe Warhammer Underworlds could fill that spot. I don't know. If we're totally honest, Games Workshop's fantasy side just doesn't sell as well as their sci-fi titles. This year at Adepticon, if you got a swag bag with your badge, it was just, it was an up fee or on your regular badge. You can get a badge without a swag bag and get it with. If you did get your swag bag attached to your badge, then you got a free copy of Skaventide, which is the 4th edition launch box for Age of Sigmar. It came out last summer, I believe. They gave away pallets of that game at Adepticon. And about 3 years ago, they did the exact same thing with the 3rd edition Dominion launch box at Adepticon. But they've never given away 40K boxes like Leviathan or Indomitus because those boxes always sell out. So, though I strongly believe that skirmish games are easier to get into as a beginner than army games are, tell me in the comments down below if you think I'm wrong, and also why. Don't just be like, well, you're wrong. Maybe they just don't need to make a new fantasy skirmish game to replace Warcry. This would allow them to focus on other games that they already have out there, put their resources elsewhere, right? Maybe this is all a kind of early indicator of where the global economy is headed, and they just decided that they needed to cut weight, as it were, and Warcry maybe seemed like the best candidate. We won't probably know because Games Workshop doesn't seem to like to communicate this kind of stuff to its customers. I mean, technically, there is still a light at the end of the tunnel. They could potentially release a new 3rd edition of Warcry in the fall, which means that they could announce it at maybe like the Tacoma US Open in July, or maybe even at the Nova Open in Washington, D.C. at the end of August. But since there aren't any big tentpole releases this summer, right? There was no big, huge launch this summer like, Age of Sigmar 4th edition or 10th edition 40K the last 2 summers, then people kind of assumed that they were going to release Warcry in the summer because there wasn't anything else much really that big going on. And it all kind of seems a lot less likely now. Warcry was a great game that was a bit hogtied by having an entire season of expensive meat tree box releases, right? But maybe also it was also hogtied just by being a fantasy-themed game, right? I've had discussions with my friend Sam Lenz about, what he'd really like is a sci-fi version of Warcry rules, what he refers to as Sci-Cry. And I don't really disagree. I personally identify more as a science fiction gamer, but Warcry did have fun and elegant rules and some pretty great models and great kind of list building mechanics and all that kind of stuff. But I probably would have enjoyed it even more if it was Sci-Cry. More so than the current version of Kill Team, for sure. So what do you think will happen with Warcry? Will they finally announce a new edition kind of weirdly late? Or is the kind of online-only status on the website a harbinger of the end of days for this title? Or will they make a new mheim and let the chips kind of fall where they may? Or maybe even something else? Let us all know what you think down in the comments below. And while you're down there, engage in some depressmentation of the like button. If you enjoy my prognostication videos of what Games Workshop will or will not do in the future. If you want to see more videos like this every single Friday, there's also a subscribe button down there. You could hit that as well. Thanks for watching.